Welcome everybody. My name's Scott Maier. This is Drawing Together with Artists Network, where we meet every Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern to draw together. So this is what we're working on today. This is episode 99. So we're coming up on 100 next week. So I'm excited. We've got some special things planned for that. So hopefully you all come back for next week's and we can see that fun 100th episode. All right, again, this is what we're working on today. This is a drawing of a tornado. So this is one that we saw just here where I live. This was on my way back from the grocery store a couple weeks ago, and I pulled over and I grabbed a shot of it, and I thought I need to do a drawing of this. I guess technically it's not a tornado. It's called like an earth spout or a ground spout because it came up from the bottom. I found that out. Rachel helped me out with that one. So. If you want to follow along, that image that's right below me here can be found in the description below. So you can open up the description, find a list of all the materials we'll be working with. You can find the image, and you can follow along. Working on this in charcoal today, and I chose to do that because I really wanted to enhance the drama of this scene by pushing the contrast, having darker darks. Now, as a result, it may be that there's not quite as much detail in some of these areas. So one of the things I'll be working on today is building a little bit more detail in some select areas to kind of pull the focus a little bit more. And if you're working in graphite, that might enable you to do that as well. You can really get in there in the cloud areas, and especially with the spout here to create a really nice dramatic effect. But I think what kind of stands out to me is like with a scene like this, you know, when you encounter something big like this in life, everything else seems to shut away. So this tornado, in fact, was taking up a very small portion of my field of vision, consciousness. That's all I could really see, right? So that's kind of what we're going to replicate here with this drawing. You know, it's really just a beautiful landscape, and you take away that spout, and it totally changes the drawing. So sometimes something small like this can really be the whole subject of the drawing. So 99% of the drawing is in service of the 1% there. So for those of you who are new, I just want you to know that this is all about sharing your process, your ideas, your questions with the community. I'm going to talk through the things that I think about as I draw and some of the techniques that I use. But this isn't necessarily me showing you this is how to draw. This is just how I draw, right? And so I'd like to see it when people kind of present alternative techniques and processes. If you have any questions or you feel totally lost, we're here to help you out. So it's an awesome community that we've got here. If you do have any questions, it's helpful if they're typed in all caps so that I can just kind of extract them from the chat field. It doesn't mean that everybody's yelling. It's just, in a way, just, I guess subtly it is kind of yelling. It's you're trying to make that voice heard and distinguished from the rest of the chat. So, all right, I've gone on long enough. Let's get to it. This is about a 9x11. You can find the reference image. I think it's sized to an 8x10. I'm drawing a little bit larger than that for the purposes here. Working in charcoal, I've got vine charcoal. That I'll be laying out the initial steps in. I've got these pit charcoal made by Faber-Castell that I'll be working with today. I love these pencils. So, and then I do have a generals that I'll be using. This is a little bit harder, but then I have a medium and a soft of these, again, the Faber-Castell pit charcoals that like I said, I really enjoy. Sharpening them was a little tricky because they really have a nice quality to them. And I was a little bit too heavy-handed and impatient because, and I've mentioned this before, if you're sharpening with a razor blade, your blade needs to be sharp. And I didn't have a sharp blade, and I kept breaking it off, and I was chastising myself for not just switching to a sharper blade. All right, other tools. Erasers. I've got a rubber eraser that I have kind of carved down to give a nice sharp point to, a kneaded eraser, and my blending stumps here. So I'm actually going to use two today. I've got this fine one, and I've got this beat up old one that I'll be using for some of the broad areas. This paper is another Legion rag paper. I believe it's the Pescia. I posted it in the description below, so you have a little bit more information about that. It's a nice smooth surface, so it'll allow me to get those details really nicely. All right, so let's get to it. So again, this is all about kind of setting the stage for the funnel cloud for the spout there. And again, it's a very small portion of the drawing, but if we build it in the right way, that can really pull a lot of the focus on the viewer. So that's what we're going to be going for today. Fiona has a question. Tell me the skills for drawing in graphite. So if you're working in graphite today, it's helpful to, let me see if I have one that's actually ready to go. So you can see my graphite pencil here. You see how I've kind of carved away at it to expose more of the core. You might want to do that with your graphite as well, especially early on, to mimic what I'm doing with the vine charcoal, building up broad areas and kind of laying out the composition. And so kind of working with like maybe a middle or a light graphite pencil, so like a 2H or something like that might be good for it to kind of, again, lay out the composition, build up some tone, and then switch to the softer ones later on to help, again, kind of bring in a little bit more contrast with it. So you might choose to use, say, a 4B up to an 8B for this. All right, we got some new viewers here, so welcome. Thank you for joining us. And if you are new and you haven't chimed in, we love to hear where people are viewing from. Share a bit about yourself, what kind of work you do. Again, we let the conversations kind of go all over the place in this, and that's what makes it fun. So this is all about, again, just getting together to draw, because we believe that drawing is an important skill that we all benefit from. It improves our artistic practice. It sharpens our skills of observation. This is really, I'm going to adjust the filters here a little bit. I'm going to reduce the contrast just a touch. To try to, it's a little bit blown out there. Let's see. So with this vine charcoal, I kind of encountered a scratchy piece to it. So if that happens when you're working with a vine charcoal, kind of keep rolling it, rotating it. This is true with graphite as well. Sometimes there's little kind of imperfections or things. These are all natural materials. So sometimes you just get something that catches on the paper and you just have to kind of work around it. So I'm just kind of thinking through some of the broad areas. And with this gesture, it's all about getting information on the page quickly. So then we start to have something that we can react to with a greater degree of specificity. In my initial stab at this drawing, I kind of rushed it. And there are some areas where the proportions, the angles don't quite align with the reference photo. And in this case, I don't think that's a big deal. But that's just my take on proportion. Sometimes it's really an essential part of your subject, and sometimes it's not. But the process that I like to follow kind of puts us in control of that a little bit. So I think today I want to be a little bit more precise and really kind of follow the reference image. So what I'm working with now is actually that small image that's right below me. So in front of me I have the projection. I'm seeing what you're seeing right now. So I can see the large drawing next to the small thumbnail. And it's helpful to use that small thumbnail because it prevents me from getting absorbed in all these cool details of the clouds and everything. And I don't want to be distracted by details early on. We're going to build this all up as a whole, and then as we go through, we'll be able to selectively control which areas get that detail and which don't. So I edited this photo in post a little bit, pumping up the contrast, and it was actually a really bright day where I was, so it was really just it was really bizarre to come out of the grocery store, look down the road and see there's a tornado right there in the middle of the road. So I pulled off the side and I grabbed this shot. Luckily, no one was hurt in this, but it was pretty scary because I couldn't tell exactly where it was going. So made for some excitement. So this was kind of towards the tail end. Apparently it had been traveling up and down the I-25 corridor for some time, and this is just before it all broke up. So just using the palm of my hand. I'm not worried about getting charcoal on me, but some of you may feel a little less inclined to do that. I know that's been the complaint with some students in the past, is that it's just the either love the tactile quality of charcoal or not sometimes. So I personally love it, and so I like to make a mess out of it, but it's not for everybody. So if you're working in graphite, again, you might be using a fairly light tone, again, using the side of the pencil as much as possible to build up these broad areas. What can happen in graphite if you're working in these early stages is if you're using the tip of the pencil, it can sometimes create these embossed lines that may serve you in the end if they're placed correctly, but if they're not placed correctly, sometimes you have to fight against them. So architect perspectives. You know, I'm in Colorado here, and so we're not far from Oklahoma, I suppose, a few hours from the border, but along the Front Range here in Colorado. We've had some fun weather this year, so. All right. Adele is saying, I only ever seen a willy willy and a water spout. We don't have tornadoes in Australia, nor here in Holland. All right, so there's Fiona is asking, tell us about the shading. So yeah, that's something that we'll continue to build throughout the whole drawing. So my initial step right now, what my goal is to simply start to form some sort of recognition of the subject. I need something on the paper, so then I can start to make specific decisions about what needs to happen. And that includes the shading. So as it starts to come together, I can say, oh, this needs to go darker or it needs to get lighter. It's difficult to make those decisions kind of in a vacuum and say, this is the exact value I need, and then go for it, because we're constantly calibrating our understanding of values based on the entire context of the drawing. So with all the white of the paper, it's throwing off everything. With so much white showing right now, for example, this is appearing slightly darker than it actually is. So I don't want to make any specific decisions about value at this stage until I start to have more relationships established, if that makes sense. So right now, again, I'm still kind of reacting to the form, and I think I have the major values established. I'm looking at the main shapes of light, dark, light, and then dark again. And it may be helpful at this stage for you to be thinking about these forms in that way, and try not to think about them as clouds or tornado or ground or grass or whatever. Think about it just purely as shapes, and then build that into greater specificity as we go along. So what I'm looking at now is this shape right here. I can start to make a specific decision about the scale of that. So what you can look at is the relationship between the height here. Let me move that in. The height here, and then the height up here. So with the reference image in front of you, I'm going to bring up a big one, big reference image on the screen over here. I'm going to compare that. So I'm going to use what's called comparative measuring. If I take a stick like this, I'm aligning the top of it with that ground plane, sliding my finger down to the bottom edge of the reference photo. So I'm closing one eye, I'm holding it over the reference photo, and I'm evaluating this height here, and then bringing that up to compare that to this. So I'm essentially taking this measurement and then carrying it up like this to evaluate that basic height. And what it shows me is that the ground plane is a little bit taller than that gap showing the sky there along the horizon. And so let's see how that plays out here. That's pretty close. I might need to bring that down here. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to carry that up the entire drawing. So what I'm looking at is a relationship between the height of the ground here and the entire height of the sky there. So I'll carry this across here. So I'm taking that measurement, again, closing one eye to flatten my depth perception, holding my arm outstretched, because that keeps the distance between myself and this stick here, it keeps that constant. Because if I move this in and out, it's going to change the scale of this relative to the reference image. So hold my arm outstretched, and I can measure up 1, 2, 3, 4 and a half. So if I take this measurement here, I should be able to measure up 1, 2, 3, 4, and almost a half, you know. So I might be able to come up here just a little bit higher. So again, taking this measurement and measuring 1, 2, 3, 4 and a half or so. So I'm in the ballpark here, and I can kind of dial that in as we go. Now, that's going to be really the main proportion that I'm looking at. So if I've established that horizon line effectively, now it's a matter of kind of breaking apart this lateral distance here, and I place that tornado smack in the middle, make that the focal point. Can't avoid it. Now again, it's really small in terms of its proportion to the entire drawing, entire image. And at this point, I can use what's called angle sighting. So if I want that general angle at the spout, now there's some curve to it, but I don't want to deal with the details of that now. I want that general angle. So I'm using my pencil again, closing one eye, placing it directly over the reference image, aligning it with the angle of the tornado there, and then I'm going to bring it across, and it looks like it's approximately the correct angle. I think I can come down here just a little bit more. Now, and I'm intentionally taking a process by which I'm not creating an outline, especially for a landscape like this. You have, these clouds that are really organic forms. The only line that I have really is that horizon line, and there's some kind of trees along there that might correlate with. But you might find it more effective to kind of capture the clouds as large shapes rather than creating an outline and then filling it in. And we can adjust those shapes as we go. So right now I'm working in really kind of an additive process. I'm building up layers of charcoal, but then I can use my eraser to carve away into that and refine the shape subtractively. So looking at the relationship between the positive space, the shape of the cloud, and the negative space, the shape of that gap there. Now I've got my paper towel here. That can help to kind of smooth things out, because that's the other kind of part of the process here, is to kind of build up layers, wipe it down, build up layers, wipe it down, and each layer you're gaining an additional level of detail, of specificity there. And by kind of dragging down there with the paper towel, it can create the appearance of the rain there. So it's not about getting the values correct at this point. I'm kind of just orienting myself in the scene. And one thing that I've noticed that can be challenging for beginners is to overcome an initial desire to make it right out of the gate. I know, having looked at this reference image for a total of we're 19 minutes into the drawing, I don't have a complete understanding of the complexity of this landscape. It's a very broad understanding, and so my drawing is reflecting that. It's reflecting the evolution of my observation. So the more I study this, the more specific the drawing will become, and I'm using the drawing process to better understand the subject. So they feed one another. I'm drawing to understand the subject, and the more I understand the subject, the better the drawing is going to be. But I want that complete understanding of the subject to happen at the end of the drawing. Like I said, though, sometimes with beginning students, we have to kind of talk about that that initial desire to, and kind of almost like in a critical way, sometimes feel like I don't understand it, I can't draw this. Well, nobody really understands it right out of the gate, right? It takes time to get there, and that's what drawing is all about for me. It's synchronizing the evolution of our thoughts with the expression on the page. So one of the areas where this, what I'm looking at and why I chose to work with this in terms of shape rather than line, is in an area like this where you can see the edge of that cloud just disappear as there is no, I mean, the cloud is the rain, right? It's just all that water is just releasing from that larger cloud formation. So it's going to be fairly kind of soft and atmospheric. And then we're going to bring out some form as we go along. So I'm still using the vine charcoal because I'm still trying to make sure I'm focusing on basic orientation of the scene, the composition. And then I'm going to switch to the compressed charcoal pencils in a little bit. It can be really helpful at this stage to let your eyes just lose focus, let them be blurry. Right now when I'm looking, everything is out of focus so that I get these main forms and values right. You're seeing the entirety of the scene as much as possible. I really like what's happening here, the way that light comes through. And so I want that to be a thing. So what I'm going to do is actually drop the value here. So I'm using the paper and I'm allowing some of this vine charcoal to just build up tone in there. So then we can erase out highlights if we need to. Okay. All right, so I'm pretty happy with the overall kind of composition at this point. So now we can start layering in some more compressed charcoal to make a little bit more permanent mark. All right, Fiona's saying, what about different types of pencil sketch? If you could kind of clarify that question a little bit, I'm not quite sure what the question is. If you're talking about different kind of approaches to drawing with pencil, I'd be happy to address that to what I can. So, but if you have anything kind of specific, let's see. Klastahan is, how do you know with the layering that the paper can still take up an additional layer? Is that based on experience with the paper brand? It is. That's a really good question. Let me think about that. I think it is. A lot of that is dependent on the brand of the paper and the type. So this is a cotton rag paper, which is fairly smooth, but it has a velvety surface that can accept the charcoal. Some other papers may not, but generally they'll layer on top of one another. What gets tricky is the layer of charcoal on top of graphite or something slick like that. One of the reasons I like to use vine charcoal is that it provides a really nice layer under the compressed charcoal. So it seems to be a little bit more gentle with accepting the compressed charcoal on top, so I can achieve a greater blend. Sometimes if I go right to the compressed charcoal onto the paper, it feels like it holds it a little bit harder, and it's harder to kind of soften those edges. So that's why I like to start with the vine charcoal. So this is a hard, like a 2B charcoal pencil, so it's a little bit harder. And I'm really just kind of refining some of the main shapes and trying to get a more permanent layer of compressed charcoal on here. And I'm looking at the main forms, the main shapes of light and dark here, and then we'll gradually add some detail. And in doing it this way, again, part of this, the goal of this in terms of the subject is to practice controlling the focal point a little bit. So if we bring everything up together at once, as it starts to come together, we can then focus on bringing up one area a little bit more, and then another a little bit more, and let other areas stay relatively unfinished. And we're going to try to find that balance. And this is what's cool, is that in drawing is that we're each going to have our own sensibility with regards to that. So some of you may feel compelled to make everything in sharp detail, and others may want to leave it completely kind of expressive and abstract. But really, the only way I know of being able to be in control of that is to think about it in terms of building it up as a whole first. So as I'm doing this, you can see I'm using the side of the pencil, and I'm trying to pay attention to the direction of my marks. It's a little bit hard to get in on this area, so I want these marks to be relatively vertical. So I've got this horizontal kind of pull to the composition, and I'm intentionally trying to use more vertical marks, kind of establishing that edge, but to kind of contrast that a little bit. Hopefully it creates a little bit more atmosphere and space when I do that. Let's see, and then Klaus is saying, as I struggle with saturation of the paper at a certain point before I finish the drawing. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think there are different types of pencils as well, or compressed charcoal. So I'm using the charcoal pencils versus like a stick, which may hold things a little bit differently. And I'm trying to be really gentle with it. That may be, it may be that there may be the heavy touch to the charcoal, but it is going to kind of stain the paper to some degree. All right, so this area here, I kind of know I want it to be a fairly broad, smooth area. So I'm starting to kind of smooth that out. And the way I'm thinking about that to create that smooth tone is to, actually I'm going to amplify things a little bit. So I've got a dark area here. You can see how I'm making this intentionally kind of blotchy right here. If that's happening on your drawing, the way to address that is now to target this area here. Kind of tighten up the marks, and I'm going to use kind of soft circular marks and start to fill that in. And then if you need to, you can just kind of gently kind of wipe that down, or with a paper towel kind of wipe that down. Target those light areas, again, fill in the gaps. And sometimes it's just, either slight imperfections in the paper or something on the surface underneath. Sometimes if I'm not careful and I'm grabbing the paper with oily fingers, that'll affect it. But if you're going for a smooth tone, my expectations are pretty low with that. I kind of know I'm going to make a mess, and so I've kind of built into my strategy the idea of that it's about kind of moving forward confidently, knowing that I have the ability to fix messes as I make them. And so as I'm building up these tones here too, I'm also rolling the pencil in my fingers, and that's continually rounding out and kind of sharpening that point. So I don't need a sharp edge at this point. So I'm not worried about getting the exact values correct at this point either. I'm starting to refine the form. So I'm looking at this edge along here a little bit more. I'm going to, I don't know, I may ignore the spout a little bit at this point. And so as I'm doing that, in general, I'm putting a little bit more pressure at the top of the stroke and then kind of flicking down. And creating a kind of a soft edge like that. I'm going to switch to this kind of modified grip where I'm holding the pencil like this, and that allows me to use the side of the pencil but gives me a little bit more control. It's kind of hard to do that on this side. All right, now that I have a little bit more all right, are we back? Hopefully we're back. Sorry about that. All right. I think we're back. My bad there. I accidentally closed the software as I was trying to make some adjustments to the color there, or the contrast. So I want to try to make it a bit more accurate. So that's the first time that's happened in 99 episodes that I've accidentally closed it down. We've had plenty of other things go wrong, but that's the first time that I've accidentally stopped the stream. All right. And now, what do I want to do here? So I think I need to get a little bit more tone on the ground plane. So with that line established, again, I'm going to use these vertical marks to create that, and we'll work on creating a little bit of depth on that ground plane as well. If you're kind of worried about being precise along this edge, at this point I'm not. I'm going to use an eraser to sharpen that up. But if you are worried about it, one thing you can do is grab a strip of paper, something like that, right? Place that on top, and then kind of go to town with these vertical marks, right? And not have to worry about creating that edge, and then it creates kind of a nice sharp edge there without drawing a line. Now, of course, on this side, I want that rain to really come down to that ground plane. I do like in this drawing that there's less of an emphasis on correct proportions. Like I said, we talked about that. We talked about it kind of at the top of the show. Some subjects just require greater proportion control, like with a portrait, for example. You got to get those. You got to be in control of those proportions, otherwise you lose control over how that person is being perceived. But already you can see the drama kind of forming when we start to lose that edge. We're creating a bit of a vignette here, darkening those corners. So the eye is going to be drawn to areas of contrast, and so with that spout, we get pulled to it because it's really contrasting the horizontal pull in the rest of the landscape. That vertical line, even though it's very small, it pulls a lot of focus because we're kind of primed to notice that type of contrast. And as I build up these layers of tone, I'm also kind of rocking that motion, so it's kind of a gentle landing and lift off. It's just happening very fast, so I'll try to slow that down. I'm really excited to get up in this area here. So I'm kind of working from the center out. And then Fiona has this question: what about skills for charcoal? I'm not quite sure the specific question that you have there, but yeah, I think really the best way to develop any skill is to kind of practice with the material quite a bit. With charcoal, I think it's important to work with paper that is designed specifically to work with charcoal. That can sometimes throw beginning students off because it just requires a surface that can actually hold the powder, the charcoal, as it's being laid down. So if you get any kind of set of charcoals, any Generals, Faber-Castell, Derwent, they all make fantastic kind of beginner sets as well as advanced sets. Get some good charcoal paper and then practice with it. And I find that charcoal is a little bit better, a little bit easier to use when you're really using the side of the pencil like I'm doing here rather than the point. Because it's softer than graphite, so you lose that point very quickly. And so this process here is about, again, building these broad areas and almost thinking about working from the center of the form outward. So we'll add the details at the outer edges of some of those forms, and we're going to work our way up to that. And I find that it kind of lends itself to that kind of thinking versus creating an outline and then filling it in. So working from the center of the form out to the edges and then bringing detail to the edges in very specific and kind of select areas. And I'm working with a kind of a harder charcoal right now. It's a little bit lighter in value. And then I'll switch to a softer charcoal later where when I need kind of darker values in select areas. And I can wipe this down here. And I do have my blending stump that I'll be using in a little bit. But I kind of like, just on an abstract level, I kind of like the way this is starting to form. And it shows you that detail is really not all that important in terms of sparking a certain amount of recognition in the viewer. So we can look at this and we kind of recognize what the scene is. And our brains start to fill in that missing information. So it can get exciting to viewers to some degree, having an opportunity to fill in the gaps. All right, so as I'm looking up here, there's this really cool cloud. And I'm just using a really light touch with the pencil. You don't need a really heavy hand at this stage. So Fiona, welcome. Hopefully I'm answering questions satisfactorily. If not, definitely let me know and we'll stick with it. And then anybody else in that's viewing, we like to hear from you as well. So if there are any thoughts or suggestions you might have for beginners, it's all about, again, drawing together and sharing ideas. Because there's so many different ways to approach drawing. But I think, for me, I think everybody should draw to some degree, and that whether that means you're doing it, as part of a larger artistic career, or whether you're doing it just for yourself. I think there's so much value in using drawing to help process the world around us. So I try to spread that as much as I can. But I also recognize there's a lot of things I should be doing in my life that I don't. So anybody who doesn't draw, I get it. There's so many things you should be doing. All right, so, and one of the things too is I'm holding the pencil really far back, which helps me to control the pressure a little bit better. And I'm using an overhand grip, which naturally kind of promotes the use of the side of the pencil. Gives me a little bit more pressure control. And so it's creating these vertical motions and then letting the arm kind of do more drawing as well. All right, I think I'm ready to, start to add a little bit more detail. I think I need a little bit more value down in here. So I'm going to drop the value, make this darker. I'm not going to add any detail at this point. I really want this to function as value contrast, to establish some sort of context for the values up here. Because like I said, there was a question earlier about shading. When you're working with values, when you're working with shading, it's all about the relationships between those values. And what makes it really tricky for us is that we humans don't have the ability to interpret a value or a color in isolation. It's always interpreted as a relationship between things. So in music, for example, there is what's called perfect pitch. I don't have it, but some people have it, where you can hear a note out of context and identify it as a C or a D or an F, right? You can just, it's its own thing. You don't have to hear it in the context of a song to know that tune. So that ability exists in humans. That, again, it's not something that I have. I kind of wish I did. It'd be awesome. Value and color, we don't have that ability, right? We can kind of get close, but we're always calibrating our understanding of those values or colors based on what's around it. And so that's where when you're working with shading and values, it's all about looking at how things interact with one another rather than achieving an absolute value that's correct. Now, if you're working from a photograph, you can physically take a value and put it on top of the one you're working on. And in that way, you're creating a direct relationship, and you can get to that point where you say that value matches that. But if you're building from observation and following a process similar to this, it's all about building those relationships together. So hopefully that makes sense. And in that way, if you kind of free yourself from needing to achieve an absolute value, you can kind of play with things a little bit, edit the scene and key things up, make it lighter, key things down, make it all darker, or pump up the contrast, or things like that that can be fun for the scene itself and make for either a more dramatic effect or create a very specific emotion, or just simply to try it out. So, but yeah, so I needed some sort of value down in here to help give some sort of context to that. Now, I'm looking at here now the relationship between the light here and the light here. And one thing that it might be helpful to practice is an indirect observation. We talk about that a lot in the series, is looking at one area but putting your awareness on something else. So I'll look at this in the reference photo, but I'll be thinking about this value here. And in that way, it helps me to see the difference between them. And then I'll switch. I'll look here, but put my awareness on this to help me understand that relationship. So if I'm looking at the reference photo and I'm looking here, but looking down, but putting my attention on this, I see that this actually gets a little bit darker down in here. So I can kind of continue to build up value. So right now there's no place on the page where the white of the paper is actually showing. There's some value everywhere. And it's also helpful to look at your work vertically occasionally, because I have the benefit again of having that overhead camera projected in front of me. And because there also is the glancing of the light off the paper affects my interpretation of the value. So it looks one way here, it's a little bit different on the screen. So you want to change that context. You want to change the relationship between you and the artwork as you're drawing to keep evaluating it and kind of giving yourself fresh eyes. All right, welcome from Brazil. All right, we've got some new people. Fiona's asking, can you use paint with charcoal? Yes. Yeah. I mean, you can. Let me think through that. I don't think I ever have beyond using charcoal as an initial layer. And then I know some people will kind of create a layout with charcoal, then a layer of spray fixative, and then paint on top of that. I was actually out painting the other day, and instead of using charcoal, I used one of these. I've got a very little bit. This is a Nero Cretacolor drawing pencil. It's more of a wax base, I think, and I really liked the way that worked to kind of scrape away some of the oils and add some layers. I mean, so you technically can use it, but it's not something that I have a whole lot of experience with, so I don't want to give you any sort of bad advice about that. I typically I don't. It can be mixed really well with pastel, which is kind of cool. And then sometimes I know there are these kind of water-soluble charcoals and graphites that can really work and create some interesting effects with with watercolor or something, or acrylic. But I think in terms of it being archival or lasting or something, I don't think there's any problem with mixing oil paints and charcoal. All right, so I'm just kind of refining this edge along in here. Trying to pay attention to the direction of my marks, but when I'm not really quite sure what direction to mark I want, I kind of switch to this short circular mark. And I'm kind of liking this harder General's charcoal that I've got is working out pretty well. Let me see what, I'm going to switch to this medium Faber-Castell. Kind of slightly different quality. There's a warmth to it that I really like. And that's the other thing to kind of look at too, that, you know, different brands of charcoal, vine charcoal versus compressed charcoal. There are some that are kind of warmer than others. So it'll be it'll have kind of a closer to a brownish quality. And then a lot of vine charcoals in particular are kind of cooler. They create a kind of a bluish effect. So as I'm working in the clouds now, I'm going to start to think in terms of both positive space and negative space. And this gets really tricky because we can look at the large form, it as a positive space shape, this here being negative space, this being negative space. But then when you're inside the form, you have a positive and negative spatial relationship as well. So we have like these darker forms here where the light starts to catch on some of those underlying clouds. We can kind of switch back and forth between thinking of them both positively and negatively, kind of additively and subtractively. So I'm kind of focusing on the darker shapes and allowing these lighter areas to emerge. So I built up that broad area of tone to push everything down. So the lights in here aren't anywhere close in value to the lights here or under here. So I want the lightest light in this area to be darker than anything in this area here. So that's why I'm starting with this broad tone, and I'm going to darken the areas around it, and I'm going to see how those tones start to appear. Now at this point, I'm also starting to shift my thinking from an abstract interpretation of these clouds to something that's a bit more observed. So now you can start to think about, as you're looking at these dark areas, what is happening on the cloud there? What am I actually doing? So this is like the underside of a shelf of a cloud that turns a corner up, and then we catch a little bit of light here on the side, and then more light behind it as the sun is kind of catching in the bowl that's formed in that cloud. So right now, I'm not really doing anything on the drawing as much as simply kind of becoming aware of the structure of those clouds. So at this stage, there's kind of there's kind of a switching back and forth between thinking of these abstractly and really understanding kind of the anatomy of the cloud, as it were. So kind of default to an abstract interpretation is my suggestion. And then ask yourself, well, really what's happening here? So as I'm building up these layers, it's these layers of kind of thin charcoal, and I'm kind of working up to the edges. So I'm not really kind of creating a line or anything as a guide. I'm kind of looking at kind of this dark area, then moving up to the edge of some of these clouds along in that negative space there. So as you get up to that edge, you can, some of these clouds kind of break apart into these wisps here. I can kind of let the tip of the pencil skip across the page and make these interesting kind of jogs and kind of changes in direction up into that edge. And as you get to that edge, if you need a little bit more detail, let your hand kind of roll in and then engage the tip just a little bit more. And then you switch back to that overhand grip to fill in the broad areas. So kind of working on detail, working from the center line upward. Sa Cortez from Portugal, welcome. I am working, in the description below, you'll find the specific paper I'm working with. This is a cotton rag paper. It's made by Legion. I believe it's the Pescia, P-E-S-C-I-A. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, so I apologize Pescia, maybe. Believe it's made in Italy. So I've been experimenting with different rag papers, from Stonehenge to this, to the Rives BFK, things like that, or different types of paper. But I really enjoy the cotton rag papers because they have kind of a velvety quality to the surface, so it holds the charcoal well, but it's not kind of an imprinted tooth that I have to then contend with. Sometimes I like those papers that have more of an imprint, just because it has, it creates an interesting effect. But I think for this one, I was drawn to that surface of the paper. That pun was intended. All right. So again, as I'm looking at this area here, I'm keeping everything in that dark range. And as I darken some of these other areas, it's creating that contrast. It's creating the impression of some reflected light. And again, it's largely an overhand grip, but as I need to add a little bit more detail, I just simply roll my hand to engage that tip there. And then right in here, there's this cool kind of wisp that comes down. So how's everybody doing? Anybody kind of stuck? I know a lot of you kind of watch the live show and then draw later. But if anybody's actually drawing along, I'd be curious to see where you're at. Again, there's no kind of requirement to follow along my process or anything. This is all about us getting together to draw and sharing our ideas. So if you take an entirely different approach, or even slightly different approach, I'd love to hear how you all handle that. We each kind of have our own association with the materials, our own paths through the drawings. So I'm just kind of changing up the direction of my mark, creating a little bit more kind of cross-hatching. And I'm evaluating right now, if the direction of the marks is playing a role in anything, how it's affecting the drawing. Boy, that's really, really kind of dark, dramatic. I kind of like it, but I don't know if I want to go much darker than that. Yeah, this paper here is really holding the charcoal beautifully. So as you can see, I've got the tornado itself. I've got it kind of mapped. It's mostly faded away. It's mostly lifted off. But I have enough of an indication there that I know I want to have that to be in sharp detail, but I'm going to build everything else around it. Again, so if you're joining us, this is Drawing Together. So we meet live every Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern to draw together. So we bring a new subject, mostly charcoal or graphite that we work in. And then this of course is this tornado. But it's what's standing out to me as an opportunity for growth is to kind of practice creating a composition in which we control very specific areas of detail, and kind of figure out what does that balance look like in terms of that detail. When do we need more? When can we pull back on that? And it's one of those things where, again, we each have our own kind of sensibility with regards to that. So I may make different decisions than you. All right. All right, let's see. Just want to make sure. Welcome, everybody. It seems like we got a lot of new people, so welcome. It's exciting. Every week we get some new people. Yes. Thank you, Adele, for posting that from the description, posting the paper. Let's see. Friday Night Character, welcome. Oh, and then Sa Cortez, do I use cotton swab or paper swab to spread the charcoal? I do. Actually, I have them here. I have them here, and I use them a lot, and I've kind of forgotten all about them. So thank you for bringing that up. I need to do that, and I think I'm going to bring them out in a little bit. I want to get a little bit more material on the paper first, and then I'm going to use use those blending stumps to add some detail in those cloud areas. So I'll kind of show you kind of my sensibility with regards to those. So right now, the only thing I'm using to blend and soften is the paper towel to kind of build up a broad area, and I'm thinking about kind of unifying those marks. When I bring out the paper towel, it's all about kind of unifying the whole drawing, because then every mark we make on top of that creates another division, and so you keep building up these divisions, and then kind of unifying again. We're trying to find that balance between variety and unity in this composition. If there's too much variety, if there's too much definition between the marks, it becomes difficult to really view and make sense of. If it's too flat and too unified, then it just gets boring. And so we're looking at that balance between those two. I'm struggling right now kind of seeing this form down in here, so I need to focus a little bit. Feather that out, and I'm just looking at some of the shapes of that light coming out of the clouds, and I kind of like just that basic value relationship at this point. I might come in and pull out a little bit more light from there, but I think as a whole, I'm going to let that sit for now. So when I bring out the blending stumps, and again, thank you for bringing that up. I kind of spaced kind of my thoughts there a little bit. I like to use them in a way that I'm always contributing to the form. You know, so those of you who have been with the show for a long time know that I've come around to the use of blending stumps and things like cotton swabs, because for the longest time I thought of them really as just tools for smoothing out areas, which they can certainly do, but I didn't really care for them much. And then when I kind of contemplated how I was using them, and instead using them as a way to physically make marks and contribute to the forms that I'm observing, then it kind of came into focus for me. I'm like, oh, that's really how blending stumps can be helpful. Okay, so I'm starting to apply a little bit more detail to specific forms in the clouds. And this is where I'm kind of falling into a trap that I'm recognizing in my head, is I'm looking at specific details in the reference, and I'm moving from one spot to one spot to one spot, and I'm not being aware of the overall context. So as I add some of those details, I'm looking for the shapes in those clouds. As I'm adding there, I need to force myself to do a quick check-in to see where I am relative to everything else. So I've got this dark patch here of rain, and I can use that as a guide to place some of the details in the clouds up here, you know, where there's this nice kind of gap here. There's also the funnel, so I can look at where I am relative to these elements. And so that's something that if you're at this point too, where you're starting to add those details in the clouds, it's really easy to kind of lose that context and just to get focused on those details. And so try to force yourself to do, again, quick check-ins to make sure you're working in the right spot as you're adding those details, and to evaluate the proportions between them. Because everything else can fade away as we focus on those details, and we don't want to lose it. We don't want to lose the forest for the trees. But this is one of those areas too, when we're looking at precision with regards to these individual cloud formations, you are each going to have your own kind of sensibility as to what is tolerable and what's not. Do you need it to match the reference photo one-to-one, or is the reference photo just a kind of a starting off point that you're referring to? But there are these really interesting forms, the way these clouds kind of interact with one another here, that I want to kind of focus on a little bit. And so what I'm trying to do is try to visualize the path, and then I'm trying to create those marks that follow the path using marks that run contrary to that direction. So if I have this path along in here, rather than run my marks this way, I'm going to run them this way, leading up to the edge of that path that I'm holding in my mind. And in doing so, it tends to create marks that feel more naturally formed. And that it may seem very subtle or minor, but it can actually make a big difference in your drawing, just the direction of your marks. Because what happens is that the viewer's mind is looking to make connections between things. So if we see that form here, that path, and all those marks run along that path, it'll mess up how we interpret that form. It'll bring everything to the surface. So instead of what we have is that path there, but we have these marks that can kind of follow along the cross contour of that form to give it a little bit more volume. I'm glad to hear that, Mary C. from Lakewood. I'm glad that's exactly what I was hoping for out of this series, is that it helps you to carve out time in our busy lives to just focus on drawing. For me, it's a form of meditation in a way, because it just brings into focus, it shuts down some of that critical mind, all those racing thoughts and things like that. So by giving myself something to focus on. So as I'm building up these areas here, kind of changing up the direction of my marks, and I'm mostly kind of chasing the darker formations. I haven't really focused on any subtractive drawing in which I refine the lighter areas yet, but we'll get there. Think about the push and pull of your drawings too. So here you can see I'm kind of flicking upward here, where to create a softer edge. Right in here, there's a really cool. I like this path. As I'm observing it and starting to create a plan, I'm thinking about creating a path that takes me up and around this form and into this space here. So that might give me a sense of where that detail will be. So if I add detail in here, come down here, then into the funnel cloud, that might create an interesting path there. All right, so right in here, there's this subtle form, this shadow right in here, and I'm going to draw a little bit of attention to it because it's a form that mirrors the angle of the tornado. So it'll be a subtle thing, but as a design element, it might make for an interesting composition to have that repetition of form, again, to kind of bring some attention up there, but hopefully keep it subtle enough where it's not drawing the eye and drawing attention from the main focal point. All right, so let me pull out that blending stump. Alan is saying, sorry I asked this again, but does the amount of detail you want to accomplish in a drawing determine the size of your canvas, or should you be able to do anything on any canvas as an artist? That's a really good question. I kind of want to throw that out to the group here to see what thoughts we get while I formulate my own thought. Because I feel like I have a thought, but it's kind of on the tip of my tongue. So I need to think through that a little bit. So basically the question is, if you're working on detail, what role does the size of the paper play in that? So as I'm thinking about that, so you can see I brought out the blending stump. I'm letting it kind of pick up material in some of these broad areas. And then as I look at the transition between the dark areas and the lights, that's where I'm really kind of putting a little bit more emphasis, and I'm changing the direction of the marks to help kind of create that, because the marks made with a blending stump do an excellent job of creating these soft shadow shapes and suggestion of detail. But I'm trying not to think about it as a linear thing. I'm trying to think about them as shapes. I'm forming these shapes here. And let this blending stump roll in your fingers to pick up and distribute that charcoal evenly. So like I said, for me, when I started to appreciate a blending stump more when I viewed it as a drawing, as a mark making tool, something that contributes to the form, as opposed to simply smoothing out an area. Okay, so back to detail. Let's see. So Costa Cortez, if you suddenly need to tighten up an area, what would you use? I would... Okay, so if I need to tighten up an area, I guess that's kind of where I'm at right now. The first step I would do would be to bring in the blending stump, see what I can achieve with that. So as I look in this area, for example, let me bring up the full size. As I look in this area here, there's a lot of subtlety in here, but some fun detail. And so I'm going to see what I can achieve using that. So kind of looking at the shapes of some of these clouds. And then I would go for a harder pencil. So I might go back to this 2B charcoal pencil, so a little bit lighter. Because if we go for the detail in a darker value, sometimes that can be overwhelming and it degrades the overall form. You want to have all those details to be in service of the entire form and the structure. If we lose that, then all those details come to the surface, and then it becomes about detail. It doesn't become about the cloud, right? So if it's all about kind of defaulting to what is being communicated about the scene. And then I see some comments about paper size. And so we see a comment here about 9 by 12 or larger. Brenda only draw 5.5 by 5.8. And JC is saying, I don't think size has anything to do with the amount of detail. There are some artists who work on enamel and tiny work, like 2 by 3 inches. Detail is staggering. Classes, for me, says, for me, details on a small format definitely have a limit. For instance, on paper with strong texture, details are really hard on a small scale. Yeah, I think those are all really good comments, and I kind of agree with all of that. I think to add to that, there is also a quality of what aligns with you in your natural mark making, right? So there are sometimes when I just want to have bigger, bolder, more expressive marks. That's the experience I want to have, and I would want to work larger for that. And there are some times when I want the experience of being tight and in control and having something that's a little bit more delicate, perhaps more precious, right? But you kind of have to identify again what experience you're looking to have. And there's a term that I like to use to help students determine the medium that you use as well as the size, which is what helps you work at the speed of thought, right? So there's a pace at which your thoughts will work at, and there's going to be some sort of delay or relationship between the processing of those thoughts and the expression on the paper. And my goal to try to limit that. I'm trying to have a seamless transition between thought and execution as possible. And so a different size will kind of play into that. So if I want each mark to mean something and to be some sort of expression of what I'm observing, if it's too large, then I'm just finding that I'm filling in space. And I'm not really making, these thoughts don't really mean a whole lot. If it's too small, sometimes I'm just fighting with it and having to constantly combat that small size. So the size that is comfortable for me may be different than what's comfortable for you. So this is about a 9 by 12 8 by 10, 9 by 12 in that area, and that is comfortable for me. There was a time though when I would work very large, and that was comfortable for me as well. So, but no longer. Now, in terms of detail specifically, it does, like Klaus was saying, there's a relationship between the materials and the paper. And so you may have a paper that just has too much tooth, too much texture to it, and is making it difficult to apply those details. And sometimes the tooth or the texture is necessary for those details. The one thing there that we talk about here, though, is that with the smaller you go, the less forgiving it sometimes can be with regards to proportions. Because when you think about, if you're trying to get the proportions correct, especially say in a portrait, if you're working very small and you're off by 1/16 of an inch, that can be a lot in the proportion, in the context of the entire portrait. If you're working very large, 1/16 of an inch is probably going to be imperceptible. And so that is something to also consider. And so I think it's, what can be difficult for me when I work too small is that I lose some control over the proportions, and sometimes it's harder to maintain an understanding of the entire context of the drawing. I get kind of lost in details and I lose the overall form. Okay, so back to here. So I'm using the blending stump to try to add some kind of details here. And I'm still drawing from the small image rather than the large one, because I feel like if I look at the large one now, a large reference image, so it's a big screen, I'm going to get sucked into those details too early. So there's, a general rule that I like to give myself, and a lot of other artists work with, is that your drawing or your painting should work effectively at a distance of 10 to 15 feet, somewhere around there. So if you hang it on a wall 10 to 15 feet away, you can still make sense of everything. What can happen is when we're close up like this, when we're working on it, everything may look great here, and then we put it up on a wall and step back, and it just either gets lost, or there's too much contrast, or the form just degrades. So that's why it's really important to step back from your work. When I'm painting in the field, I'll often step back 20, 30, 40 feet away and see how it holds up. Walk up to it slowly, and at each step try to evaluate what's happening to the space and the form and the scene. And with the goal that if it's working at a distance but it's not working up close, then I need to keep working at it. If it's working up close but not at a distance, then I need to keep working. I need to have that work at all distances. And so working small for me, it makes it difficult to work at a distance like that. So. All right, hopefully that made sense. Alan is saying, like, if I'm able to do details in very small spaces, then it's easier for me to do it in normal size, so I should practice in like a 3 by 3 centimeters. So that's got to be about a 7 or 8 inch portrait. Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth it to experiment with a variety of sizes to see what works. My general approach to detail is similar to, might actually be kind of an extreme example of reserving detail for select areas, rather than bring the entire drawing up to the same level of detail. And it's about finding that balance between between the detail. When is it not enough? When is it too much? And so this is where working from a small reference is generally helpful, because it shows you what's important. Because when we focus on something, where we're looking, if we get captured by the details of a scene, it pulls our focus, and the nature of focus is to ignore everything else, right? That's what focus is. It's putting all of our attention in a very small area. That distorts things like color and value relationships. And so we need the ability to pull back and see the entire context. So so much of the drawing and painting process is that fluctuation between close look and distant look. You know, we're looking at the forest, we're looking at the trees, we're looking back and forth between them. And there are some practical things we can do, like stepping back. You can flip it upside down, you can hold it in front of a mirror, take a photo of it and look at the small thumbnail on your phone. All sorts of things that we can do to change that context and see it kind of in a new way. And when I work small, it's like I said, it's harder for me to maintain that context. But using a small reference is often kind of an easier way to see the forest for the trees, so we don't get caught in those details. But you know, so again, that's my kind of natural inclination, is to kind of find that balance. You know, where can I get away without more detail? But that's not for everybody, and it comes down to the type of experience that you want to have. Well, what marks do you feel like making? What kind of experience do you want to have in that drawing? Do you like being tightly controlled? Do you like being loose and expressive? And I get a little distracted when I'm drawing or painting, and kind of sometimes I can't make up my mind. So then the drawing kind of becomes both. I know I'll tighten up for some area and I'm like, that feels good, and then I'm like, I'll get the itch to just go and create a broad expressive mark across it because so then I'll do that, and then I end up with a painting or a drawing that's kind of in this no man's land, where it's kind of between expressive and detailed. But all right, so I need to continue to kind of massage these kind of smaller forms in here, because I'm seeing that there's kind of a misalignment of some of these forms. And when you're using the blending stump, again, kind of be thinking about the planes of the clouds as we're coming through. So we have kind of a front edge here, and then it turns back under the shelf. I'm just going to kind of smooth this whole area down. They're good questions that we got coming out today, and that's really what this is about. It's not just about the technique of drawing. Kind of let this go in a variety of directions. So you guys always ask some really interesting questions. But I'm pretty happy with the values that are building here. You know, sometimes we make decisions purely on a design level. You know, so I'm looking at like this angle here. Something seems a little bit different than the reference photo. What I feel like is happening is that it's a bit too flat, and I just want to create a little bit of a modulation of that edge, create some more rhythm, movement to that edge. So I'm kind of really amplifying this kind of undulating effect. Adding a little bit of detail to that rain patch. Make it a little bit wider. And it's one of the things about landscape that I like, is that it does become a little bit more forgiving with regards to proportion. So I'm seeing some things that feel a little bit off. But I need to ask myself, is that okay? All right. This is a scene that was, it was like this for maybe all of 30 seconds. This thing was moving up there to the north. These clouds are always in motion. And so getting it exactly right, is, based on the photograph, I don't know as if that's really my goal here. But I do want it to be truthful at the same time. So if I play too loosely with the composition, then I run the risk of it not being an honest kind of interpretation of the scene. But again, that's where we each have our own association with that, and you may have a completely different outlook on that. Maybe it has to be 100% truthful to the reference photo, or maybe it needs to be something entirely different. Okay, here we go. Let's see. Let's see, Klasahan, where do you place the focus? Is it at the tornado or the lighted clouds? So that's a really good question, Klaas. So I think I'm going to do both. Now, just that form right here, once we get that tornado kind of built in, that's naturally going to pull our attention because it's such a contrast to these horizontal elements here. But I love what's happening up in here, and I kind of just want to stay up there a little bit. And for me, it's like this tornado, it isn't just a funnel cloud. Like, it's an entire system, it's an entire weather system. And so I want to kind of capture that scene. That's what was really cool about this, is that have this vast landscape, and then you have this thing that's just tearing through it, and it draws, like, again, it only takes up a small portion of our field of vision, but 100% of the focus. 1877 says, hey, I think your lines in the bottom are kind of straight. Yes. I think if you're talking about the clouds, I don't know if that was, if you posted that before or after I was talking about kind of creating that rhythmic line there. But yeah, I think we were kind of thinking the same thing. And then when I get down to here, I want to have those be intentionally straight to contrast against kind of the organic forms up in the clouds. So that was a really good observation there. Yeah, and then 1877, those are great comments. So anybody feel free to throw out observations. You all have helped me through so many different kind of tough spots. And because we're kind of rushing through a drawing like this and talking as I'm going, there's a lot of stuff that I'm going to be missing, and we wouldn't be drawing together if I wasn't getting feedback from you all. So feel free to throw it out there, even if it's something that I just either haven't gotten to, or sometimes it's something I just completely overlook, or maybe I've thought about but haven't kind of addressed. It can be good to bring it up. So. All right, so I'm gonna sharpen up some focus right in here. So how am I gonna do? So again, if you look at the small thumbnail of the reference and you let your eyes lose focus, this area just becomes this white glowing spot, right? And then as we focus on it, you see all of these nuanced lines, these layers of clouds and light and stuff. But because when we blur our vision and look at it small, because all those details fade away, that tells me that the contrast is very low. So that's something I need to keep in mind as I'm adding these details. So that's one thing that I see happen that with some beginning students is when we become aware of details, it tends to, in our minds, heighten the contrast beyond what is actually happening. So keep that contrast in this area low to maintain a sense of unity in the light. So I've got my kneaded eraser. I can shape it how I want. And what I'm going to do now is kind of target some of these light areas. And yeah, I see areas where I'm kind of off with regards to some of these details. And like this cloud here, that's totally the wrong shape based on what I'm seeing in the reference, but I'm just going to leave it. I'm going to use the reference as an understanding of generally where the light and dark marks are. And I'm going to try to, again, target these light areas where the light is striking the clouds. And this gets tricky because there's so many different layers. So in some areas we're seeing the gaps between the clouds where the light sky is showing. In some areas it's light catching on the edge of the clouds. But what I like about this kneaded eraser is that I can keep reshaping it, and it changes up the quality of the marks. And hopefully make it feel more naturally formed. Like right in here, that light just seems to glow, and it kind of feathers out. And so I'm looking at kind of the relationship between light and dark along that edge. And right in here, it gets light again against that dark cloud. So what I'm looking at is kind of, again, that alternating sequence between light and dark. Okay. Okay, Tom, teach. I missed the first 30 minutes. Did you begin by removing the white background with a charcoal stick like you demonstrated in the coffee cup video? Yeah, so the first 30 minutes was really with the vine charcoal, building in these large masses, then wiping down with a paper towel to build up some tone. So I didn't apply any marks really to this area, but I let some tone build up by using a paper towel that essentially got dirty. Boy, this gets tricky. So when I'm looking at these details, I'm trying it intentionally to just take quick glances rather than really kind of focus and study. Because the longer you look at something, the more it actually gets distorted. And I find that 100 quick glances is better than 100 minutes staring at something. And so what I'm doing now is, like, when I look over at the reference photo, I kind of know the area that I'm targeting. So for example, I'm going to look right at this area, and I'm going to come right to that area in the reference photo, make a quick assessment, and then try to apply it to the drawing rather than get kind of fixated on it. But that may be something that's just the way I work. You may have a different association with what's necessary to really kind of study the form. So I wanted to ask everybody, how is the audio sounding today? So I got a new microphone, so hopefully it's all sounding all right. We were having some issues in the past. I know sometimes the playback would be really light in volume. As I'm doing this, so now I'm working subtractively. I'm seeing a bunch of these little issues with regards to the form of the clouds. I'm a little off in some areas, so I'm going to have to kind of live with that, and hopefully capture kind of the overall quality to it. But I know that I'm off in some of these areas, and I'm just going to have to kind of accept that for now, because I don't want to eat up too much time correcting things, and that's, yeah, I don't want to keep you guys here too long. Okay, let's see. Socrates, at the horizon line, you have a really bright spot. How do you fix it? Let's see. Oh yeah, like right along here, there's a building that's catching the light. We'll get to that in a little bit when I get down there. That's just going to be lifted out with the eraser. All right, I'm glad the audio is sounding good. but we lost a few words every now and then. Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much. Everybody else, how are the drawings coming? How are they coming? Anybody working in graphite by any chance? I'd be curious to see how that's working for you. And as you're answering there, so now what I'm looking at is we kind of erased out some of the highlights. And I'm going to start working on some of those middle values. So now we have kind of the light areas. That transition into those darks is a bit harsh at this point. So I want to adjust that. Before I do that, I'm going to sharpen things up a little bit using this rubber eraser. A rubber eraser gives you a little bit more pressure. You can lift off a little bit more material perhaps than with the vine charcoal. And I can kind of sharpen up the edges in some areas. And so I'm intentionally kind of darting around the whole drawing, kind of adding a little bit of detail here, a little bit of detail there, rather than one kind of continual path, adding those details, because I'm sneaking up on that kind of intentionally. I don't want to apply detail everywhere. I'm going to kind of bring it all up. Okay. And then there's a question, is there a standard ratio on the measure of paper for professional work, or you get what the manufacturer sells? Yeah, I mean, in general, I'm kind of, these actually come in larger sheets, like a 22 by 30, so I kind of tear them down. And I'm working generally like either a 9 by 11 or 8 by 10 or, 10 by 12, somewhere in there. And so I'm kind of doing that on purpose to make things that are a little bit easier, a little bit more standard for viewers to follow along. If you get to the point where you're framing your work, then that starts to become a consideration, but a little bit unfortunate. It's hard because custom framing gets so expensive, right? But at the same time, if I'm doing like a really finished painting or something like that, and not just a study, then I want specific dimensions. So I may do like a 16 by 9 dimension or something, and just know that I'm going to have to build a frame for it, or pay a custom framer. I think in general, like if you know you're going to be committing time to an image, I think it's worth it to choose a specific dimension rather than default to what is in the store. Generally, what you buy in the store is good though for, it's a pleasing dimension. So I do a lot of work that's kind of standard dimension. So hopefully that makes sense. I don't know if I really answered your question, and maybe that's how everybody, what everybody else thinks too is that. So, okay, so I'm kind of again targeting these middle areas, the transition between the light and the dark. I feel like it's just too dark. So I'm just going to press with a kneaded eraser, lift that a little bit. And what's nice about the kneaded eraser is that it allows you to really kind of roll along these forms. And I can round it out like this, so it creates a nice gentle lift. And I'm just using the weight of the eraser here at first. And it's almost blending more than anything. And then I want to evaluate what's happening. And then this is where I'm kind of letting the material do its own thing, and then evaluating from there. And sometimes a mark just looks great, even if it's not what is happening in the reference photo. And again, that's one of the decisions that you can make as an artist is, do you want to keep that, or do you need to continue to adjust it? But sometimes it's just kind of experimenting with the eraser, thinking about the form, almost sculpting it on the page, and then playing around with pressure to see see what's happening. If you keep it light, then you can kind of sneak up on things, and it's not going to be too harsh. And then I want to just kind of step back, see how it's evaluate it in the context of the whole here. And I think that's generally the secret to texture as a whole, is to allow the materials to kind of do their own thing and suggest, and let the viewer's mind take over to fill in the missing gaps. It's exciting for viewers' minds to solve those problems and fill in missing information. So I like to give the viewer's mind something to chew on. It becomes very satisfying. So a lot of this with a kneaded eraser is this kind of rolling motion. And so like that shape I lifted here does not look exactly like what's in the reference photo. But I want the effect to be a convincing sensation of that bounce light happening into that dark side of the cloud. That's more important to me than the fidelity to the reference image. Change up the direction of your marks, really kind of play with these forms. I got a little lost here. There we go. Sometimes you get caught in these details, and I got a little lost in there, lost my orientation points. So with the kneaded eraser, it's a matter of making a few kind of marks with it, reshaping it, being fairly gestural with it, reacting to the form rather than fighting to control it. And I want to see as it overall, it feels a bit dramatic to me. Maybe a little bit too dramatic, but we'll see. We'll see how it all plays out. All right. And then what's the best way to preserve the charcoal once it's completed? We've talked about that a little bit before. I'm trying to remember what I said so I can be consistent. I guess I don't really preserve a lot. Like right now, I have this box that's right next to me and has all of them just stacked up, and they're getting all messed up. So that's not a great way to preserve them. If you don't think you're going to frame it or anything, I kind of like to preserve them, lay them flat with a sheet of kind of plastic, like a Mylar sheet between them to help preserve it. I generally don't like to spray fix, but I don't really have a good reason why. Like sometimes the spray fixatives can adjust the contrast, but I'm not that precious with my work. So I think a spray fixative is generally going to be pretty good, but I think there's part of me that thinks that, well, maybe I want to touch it up, and if I spray it, it's hard to do that. And then the best way, of course, is to put it behind glass with a mat, frame it. All right, there's this one cloud right in here that has this beautiful light kind of shining along that edge. So I'm using kind of the sharp corner of this eraser to pick out little spots along that path. So rather than one continual line, it's a sequence of these marks here. And then a kneaded eraser is great for creating like these, almost like brush marks. So I'm going to look at some of these forms, see how they're you're reading, do they feel kind of natural or do they feel artificial? This right here feels too dark. So as I squint at the reference, you know, this, and I squint at my drawing, this thing really stands out. So I'm going to lift off some charcoal there, just kind of pressing and pulling. And it's kind of almost like an overhand technique with the kneaded eraser, because with a light touch I can smooth and blend a little bit. So I'm lifting some material, but I'm kind of sneaking up on it. I don't want to erase it all down and then have to rebuild it back up again. All right. Liz, you'll be here for the 100th episode next Wednesday. I can't believe it. Yeah, Mad Moments Go says spray fixative can ruin some works. Yeah, I don't know as if I've ever had anything get ruined, but I don't really know why I choose not to fix it. So if any of you have experience with that, like Mad Moments Go, then you probably speak better to it than I can. All right, so I'm trying to think now, as I look at this, is there an opportunity for greater detail in some areas? So for example here, this is, if we just look at this section here, it's not very detailed at all. But if this becomes a focal point, then that's fine. I can leave this how it is. The brain doesn't need detail here. If anything, it just becomes a distraction. So let's see. Ooh, the rocket. Could you do this without all this weird stuff? I'd be curious to what weird stuff you're referring to. I don't know. And then, what the plan is for Monica is asking what the plan is for next week. So I'm not going to reveal the image until that day. So normally what I would do is after this drawing, I'd start working on next week. So, you know, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday this week, I'd be posting next week's drawing. So we'll have it set up, but the specific subject and the reference is going to be revealed there on that 100th episode. And we're planning some fun things at Artist Network to celebrate. So I'm working on potentially a Zoom meeting, bring in some other artists that I've worked with, and we can all draw together to share ideas about drawing. But we'll be announcing all those next week as we're working on some of those forms. So, all right. So as I'm looking at this area, I want to bring a little bit more focus into this. I'm going to bounce all around this area, adding a little bit. So I'm using the harder charcoal in this. It's a little bit lighter because I don't want an intense value like this. Now it's really starting to bother me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of take these small circular marks right up to the edge here, and so in that way it's a little bit dark, but it's a very fine line. So it's not pumping up the contrast too much in that light area. I'm just using the weight of the charcoal itself to make these marks. So it's all going to be very subtle in here. And it's thoroughly overwhelming with all of these details. You know, looking at the relationship between the lights and the darks, because we look at some dark areas, that's one section of cloud, and then it transitions to light. And I'm like, well, is that which layer of cloud am I looking at this area? And I can't really quite figure that out. And I don't know if I want to get sucked into that. So I'm just going to trust the shapes of light and dark that I'm seeing here. And what I'm trying to do as I encounter these forms is, you know, I really like this shape here. Even though in the reference it's pretty soft, I'm sharpening it up, you know, beyond the reference photo. And that's the only area where I'm really thinking about the contour line. In every other area, it's kind of thinking about more about the shape. So kind of working in the center of the shape out to the edge to find those details. So if I look at this cloud, for example, starting in that inner form and working my way out to the edge and then tightening it up. And in that way, I'm not outlining any forms. If I outline these forms, I run the risk of them kind of degrading and just being visually confusing. So I've kind of darkened that. I've amplified kind of the drama up in this corner. I'm just trying to figure out, well, where do I need the detail? I kind of feel like I need a little bit more detail in this area here. So I'm using just these small kind of circular marks that are omnidirectional to fill in some of these details. You know, we're an hour and 45 minutes in. I generally don't like to go over 2 hours for these shows, but we may go a little bit longer because I'm having a lot of fun and I don't want to stop. And it's my show, so I can keep going. So, but I know it's a long time for you all. But I think we're going to be pretty close to finishing this up. You know, this hardest part is really this cloud here. But I do want to get that funnel cloud put in there. That's the star of the show, and we haven't even touched it yet. So really what adding detail is at this point is just sharpening edges in certain areas. You know, so right here, that's a really soft edge. If I try to match that value but just create a sharp edge, that starts to suggest greater detail in there. Right in here, this is a really cool, I like the way these wisps of clouds come down. And I think looking down in here, I think I want to sharpen this dark edge right in here. So again, kind of start more from the center of the form, work out to that edge. So that might be something that's easier to kind of contemplate when we're talking about details. Is it less about adding detail and more about sharpening edges? It's that edge variation that becomes so critical to the form. You know, if the edges are too sharp, then we run the risk of it degrading the overall form and not making much sense visually to the viewer. If everything's too soft, then we run the risk of it not really being clear enough for the viewer. Some of these forms I've definitely missed the mark on some of these forms, actually, so I'm going to get rid of this, but I don't know, I'm looking at the overall effect now to see how it's holding up. Just think about now in your work, where do you feel compelled to sharpen up those edges? So, all right, so I think I'm happy, generally happy with that. I feel like this area here is probably as sharp as I want it to get, because then otherwise it's going to pull my attention off this way too much. All right, so let's get to this funnel cloud. That'll be fun. All right, so we generally mapped out the path for it. So this is where I have the larger image right now. Let's see. Greg, welcome. Good to see you on here. Mad moments go. The plan is to have an online party. Yeah, we're going to see what we can do for that. So, all right, so now again, I have the larger image here, and I think we can kind of bring in a little bit more focus here. So again, there's really not much to this tornado, right? It's really the fact that it's breaking these strong horizontals. It's that contrast that makes it so visible. So it shows you that in this entire scene, just a small portion of it can actually make the whole thing. And that's the nature of what happened in this original scene when I was out there, is that, you know, it's this tiny little thing that's taking up a fraction of a percent of my entire field of vision, but 100% of my focus. And so we want this drawing to kind of achieve that same thing. We have this large drawing, tiny focus, or tiny focal point, but hopefully it's going to bring a lot of attention from the viewer. So, so as we come down in here, we have this general path, and I'm going to, rather than outline it, I'm going to do what we were doing earlier. So start from the center of the form and work my way out. Actually, I'm going to switch to this this Faber-Castell. These small circular marks. And you know what's kind of cool about this is that this is one, again, that started from the ground. And then it kind of went up to the cloud. And so you can actually kind of see evidence of it here. There's this inner funnel that's a little bit tighter that if you zoom in on this reference photo, you can start to see. And I think I want to kind of capture that. This inner funnel, and then it's pulling debris up from the ground that's making the bottom kind of more substantive. So again, I'm not using lines really at this point. I'm trying to still think in terms of shape, but just on a smaller scale. And then there's this kind of sharp edge in some of these areas here. So right in here, for example, we've got that kind of the center where it's a little bit darker. And then as it's whipping around at the base, it starts to become a bit more diffused. I don't know if anybody here was in the area and saw this. It could be pretty terrifying. I know a lot of people were kind of impacted by it. I mean, like I said, it didn't do a whole lot of damage, but we don't often get them this close in the Front Range. They happen a little bit farther out east on the plains where we get a lot of them. And so it can be somewhat of a traumatic event, just seeing one of these things. All right. So you can see right there, all of a sudden that, to me, it changes the entire scene. Those few little marks make everything. Now, what do I need to do? I think what I need to do is bring in, actually I'm gonna smooth this out with the blending stump, trying not to lose that edge. Break it apart in some areas to anchor it into that cloud, because it's really all one thing, right? And then what I'm going to do is use this rubber eraser to kind of sharpen up along that edge in some areas, not the whole way, but there's this kind of bright spot back in here. kind of feather it out towards this rain patch here. So kind of changing up the direction of my marks between this horizontal kind of pull and then the vertical kind of orientation of the this rain cloud, so the rain that's falling there. So what we're looking at here is like the kind of striations of clouds in the distant horizon, and then the kind of the vertical-ish path of the rain that's falling. So I'm kind of alternating between these horizontal marks and these verticals. So right in here we can kind of do the same thing. So really light pressure first to see what we can achieve with it, and then as we need more, kind of lean in on it. So kind of sneak up on some of those. And there is kind of a touch to it where I'm trying to be sensitive to the marks as I reach the edge of the clouds, because that can help to define those a little bit more. And if I just kind of gently wash over it, it'll help to kind of soften and blend those. Looking in the larger photo, you see a little bit more variation in some of this cloud here, and I kind of like that. Break that up a little bit to kind of bring things in. All right. This feels a little bit dark. I mean, a little bit light here. I want to darken this up just a touch. So a little wash of charcoal here to drop that value down. Pretty dramatic. All right, and then I might come in here and bring this down a little bit, sharpen up this edge. Oh, Rebecca saying that there was a tornado in your area. Lots of damage. Yikes. Pretty scary. So as I'm trying to sharpen up this line along in here, add a little bit more movement to it, so it's not quite so horizontal. But 1877, you're the one that kind of called that out, I think, in a very effective way. And I'm kind of working on creating an undulating line a little bit more. That's a good observation. As I'm doing that, I'm trying to like skip across there. I don't want it to be a line because that's going to flatten everything. It's just going to pop to the surface. All right, so let's see what happens now if I drop that horizon line in. So I've got the advantage here of this raised bar on the edge of my drawing table, so I can rest my arm on it, and you can see the table shake there. And it's generally oriented with the paper, so I can use that as a guide to help create a straight mark here. But I don't want to draw a line. Again, that's going to flatten things out. I'm going to lose a sense of light and shadow if I do that. But there are these dark patches of these trees on here that I can focus on. So I'm going to grab the soft charcoal, and let's see. Well, the first thing is, I can't remember who called out that bright spot on the horizon is this building. I think actually I need to place that. And so with the eraser, I'm kind of erasing out where that is, but I'm overstating it. I'm gonna have to cut into that to refine that a bit more. And then there are kind of buildings along here that are catching the light. And I think I'm just gonna be suggestive of those things rather than thoroughly descriptive. there's that lighter path of whatever's growing there is a little bit lighter, that I want to erase out. So, but I'm doing this intentionally, knowing that I may overstate that. I may erase out too much, because then I can refine it farther with this pencil. So this is where I'm going to come back in, and I'm using this as a guide to help me create a horizontal mark. And so if you have a table or something, you might do that as well. Another tip is to, if you can hold your pencil in such a way, something like this, where you can see my pinky is kind of locked in on the edge of the paper, you can kind of carefully kind of score a line across there to help keep things fairly parallel with the bottom edge of the paper. Or, you know, like we did earlier, you can, you know, place down a piece of paper, and that becomes kind of a guide for you. But I don't think I want to do that. So I'm thinking more about that bottom edge, and then as we move up to the trees, creating some variety there. You know, there's a general rhythm to the spacing of these trees that I'm going to try to get roughly, but you know, I'm not going to be 100% accurate. There's this larger clump over here, and so I'm just looking at some of these other elements. Where is that relative to the cloud formation? And I'll drop that in. Now the one thing to pay attention to with these forms is that we've got a group of like 4 trees right in here. Each one is slightly different in shape. It's something that I have to fight, is this natural ability to create a rhythmic arrangement of those marks, and have 4 kind of equally spaced, equal kind of symmetrical shapes on there. And that it's just not what I'm seeing, but my brain wants to create something that's regular and repetitive, so I have to intentionally fight that. Oh, there's this cool silo right here that catches the light. I don't know if I placed that properly, but I'm going to lift that out, and then right around the edge, just kind of gently sharpen up around that edge. If that's a little too sharp, I can just tap it out, and that kind of softens the edges a bit. And I think that's enough for that side. I like the way I have enough to anchor the ground plane there, but everything also feels like it's kind of falling into the that rain cloud there. All right, so as I come across here now, I need to figure out, where does this tree line stop? There's this building here. Again, I don't want to I'm falling into this trap of detail, and I don't want that. I want to look at this line of trees, make sure it feels broken and natural. It's not just a solid dark line. I think that was in the preparatory sketch. I felt like I made it too sharp and consistent. All right, how's everybody doing? Getting a little tight in the shoulder here, so. Kadisha Art, hello. Anybody new? Anybody just joining us? If you are, what you're watching is a show called Drawing Together. My name's Scott Maier, and we're with Artist Network. So we do this every Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern. We draw together. So we're on episode 99. There's 98 other episodes already, which is crazy, blows my mind. And it's just all about us getting together to draw together, talk about drawing, talk about art, sharpen our skills. We kind of agree that drawing is something that it's helpful to have a steady kind of practice, and having a group like this can help us be accountable to that. All right, so as I'm looking down here, so now I have this challenge to create a ground plane, right? It being a rectangular form like this, I have a lot working against me. I just have these stripes. I don't have any road leading in, any kind of perspective lines. What I do have is scale. And so what I'm going to look at is, we have this thin white light line here. And we have these kind of striations, these different grasses here that have different widths and thicknesses. And so that's kind of an important thing to focus on. And so one of the things you can do is look at, in particular, the edges of the paper and the gap, the spacing between these marks. So if we have a dark line here, it gets a little bit lighter, and then another dark line comes in here. And we're looking at the relationship between this, and this, having some variation there. If that's evenly divided, then it's going to flatten things out. And so it's in the reference photo, it feels like this darker patch is a little bit taller, a little bit higher than this lighter patch. And then we have another dark, thin line here, and then into lighter again. And so we're looking for a nice ratio there. And then also we have the scale of our marks available to us to help create depth. So just marks here in the foreground, as we move back, just kind of tighten up, thinner, flatter marks there. And so it'll be very subtle, but again, because we don't have like a road leading into there, any sort of perspective lines, we're using the other tools available to us to create that depth. And we don't have to have a lot of detail, but we want the viewer to kind of accept it as a ground plane and not essentially a wall that we're looking over. So as I encounter this edge here, I'm going to add some suggestion of those grasses, so a little bit bigger marks here. So just using the side of the pencil, letting it roll in my fingers, it creates really fine lines, and they feel more naturally formed rather than switching to this tripod grip. And this is all just to give enough information here that the viewer's mind will accept it and move right past it, right? And not get caught in those details. And that's ultimately, as I was looking at this thing, we've got several miles of landscape between myself and the tornado here, and but it didn't feel like that. My mind just skipped right across it and went way back there. That's all I could see in my mind. So you want that similar type of effect. Again, enough information that we accept the landscape, but we intentionally kind of move past it. So creating rhythmic lines as we move across. And as we see kind of these darker lines here, I'm trying to think about, try to visualize the path of them, but create them as an accumulation of marks that run vertically, kind of aligning with the direction of the grasses themselves. And in that way, I think we're pretty much done. I could continue to add more details, but I think the spirit of the scene has been captured. I don't know as if I can really describe anything else that's happening. So I think I might call it a day. And when it comes to detail, one of the things I'm thinking about is that you can often get away with just a sequence of short dots and dashes rather than continuous lines. So kind of start by creating almost constellations on your page. And then if that's not enough, you continue to fill them in. And then move on. All right. Thank you, everybody. Any other remaining questions, thoughts, comments, concerns, observations? And I think I'm about ready to sign off here. This has been a lot of fun. I was really looking forward to doing this drawing with you all. Pamela, welcome. Looks like a new viewer from California. Thank you, Klaus. Medini, so is it Pratik Kati? Okay. We have a lot of new viewers today, so I welcome you all. Hopefully we'll see you again next week. We're going to be 100 episode. Again, craziness. We have lots of fun subjects that we draw with. I try to change it up each week. I think we did the dancer last week, but I think we're due for a portrait pretty soon. I don't know if we're going to do a portrait next week, but hopefully sometime soon we'll get into another portrait. So we try to vary things up just to see what subjects can help us advance our understanding of the medium and our hand-eye coordination and all that such, and what's just kind of fun to draw. So now, if you're new, you're going to want to know that you can share your work if you're done. You can go to artistnetwork.com. I pinned the link in the chat, and there's also a link in the description to the show page where you can share your work. So we've been seeing a lot of amazing work. I apologize for issues with the dancer episode from last week. Somehow on the WordPress page, the comments got turned off, so some of you weren't able to share your work until very recently. So I think that was my fault for I didn't build it correctly. So I'll take the blame for that one. Yeah, thank you for letting me know about that. I think Pia, you're the one that gonna call that out. So again, thank you all. I think I'm going to sign off. Looks like all the questions have come in. Wait, Sacortez, what do you think about turning the reference black and white to help the drawings? Oh, that's a good question. We had that question quite a bit before. Really, I don't know. I don't believe in rules, really, that you can or can't do anything. What I believe is identifying what your objective is. So the objective I set for become better at drawing from observation, better at drawing and painting from observation. Now, since I can't be outside with you all to draw this, I have to work from a photograph. And so working from a colored photograph gives me that challenge of trying to translate the value of color into the value or the tone in the charcoal or the graphite. And so again, that just helps me to build that skill for when I'm painting on location. But that may not necessarily be your objective. So by converting it to black and white, you're allowing the computer to make those decisions for you that says that this color equals this value. When I'm painting on location, I don't have that ability very easily, and I kind of like that challenge of trying to figure it out. So that's why I work from the colored photograph. So hopefully that makes sense. It's really just because I think setting ourselves intentional challenges is how we get better, and so that's what I'm doing. But if I were given a commission, for example, and I really had to dial in that drawing, I would totally work from a black and white photograph to help check my values and things like that. So again, as an exercise, I don't choose it, but as a general practice, there's nothing wrong with it. So just whatever furthers your current objectives. All right, excellent. Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun. I'm gonna sign off now. We'll see y'all next week, episode 100.